what makes Socrates, well, Socrates, even if, say, he'd never run into a dog in his whole life.
Hmm.
It's, I don't know, it gets you thinking, right? Like,
Hmm.
it kind of throws us right into this huge philosophical debate about what's essential, really fundamental to something versus what's just sort of accidental, like it just happens to be true. And that, I think, takes us straight to this idea of essential versus accidental properties.
Yeah, spot on. You can definitely imagine a Socrates who just wasn't a dog person, right?
Yeah.
Or heck, maybe he was more of an olive guy than Hemlock. Who knows? Those are things I guess he could have lacked and still been Socrates. But could you have a Socrates who wasn't even human? I mean, that's where things get really interesting, right?
Yeah, it's not just some abstract puzzle.
No, no, not at all. This distinction, it's actually fundamental. It gets to the heart of what it means for something to be something, for identity itself.
Right, like what makes a thing that thing?
Exactly. And for all you philosophers out there thinking through this stuff, it's powerful. Like it sharpens your philosophical toolkit. It gives
Yeah.
you this surprising clarity on some really, really basic concepts. And we've got a whole bunch of sources here tackling this from all sorts of angles.
Okay, so let's get down to business. Today we're going deep on these ideas, these essential and accidental properties, how philosophers have tried to pin them down.
Yeah, Zach.
We'll start with this intuitive modal approach, thinking about like necessity and possibility, right? But we're also going to dig into some of the more innovative ways people have tried to explain this.
Yeah, cool.
So we're going for the full picture here of what's really at stake when we're, trying to figure out what's truly essential to something, what makes it it.
Okay, so the basic modal characterization, right? It starts with this idea, and I think it's pretty intuitive, for anyone who's thought about this stuff philosophically. An essential property, it's something an object has to have, like it's unavoidable for it to be that thing. And an accidental property, well, that's something it just happens to have, but it could lack it, without ceasing to be that thing. So that has to, right, that points us to necessity, and that could, well, that's possibility. And as any logician will tell you, these two, they're like two sides of the same coin.
Right.
Necessary basically means not, possibly not, and possible means not necessarily not.
Okay.
So if Socrates must be human, right, then it's not possible for him to be non-human. Simple as that.
Right. It's like saying if it's necessary that 2 + 2 = 4, then it's not possible for 2 + 2 to be anything other than 4. So we're applying this to properties now.
Exactly.
If Socrates necessarily has the property of being human, then he can't possibly lack it. And conversely, if his love of long walks is accidental, well, it means he likes those walks, sure.
Yeah.
But we can think of a Socrates, like who hates walks, and he's still Socrates.
Yeah, yeah. And this is where, that idea of possible worlds, it becomes really, really helpful.
Oh yeah, possible worlds, right?
Yeah, philosophers use this idea, this concept of possible worlds, to talk about ways things could have been, like alternative scenarios, different states of affairs. So an essential property, it's one that an object has in all the possible worlds where it exists. Any way things could be, it's got that property. An accidental property, well, it might have it in our world, the actual world. But there are other possible worlds, right, where that same object exists, but doesn't have that property. So think about Socrates again. You can imagine all sorts of scenarios where he exists, but he's always human.
Right.
But there are definitely worlds, where Socrates is there and he's not a teacher, or
Right.
he didn't marry Xanthippe, or like we said, he's never even seen a dog.
Yeah, I mean that feels right, doesn't it? Like
Yeah.
on a gut level,
Yeah.
most philosophers, I would think, would agree that being human, that's way more fundamental to Socrates than who he's married to, or even the kinds of social circles he runs in. But as simple as this seems, right? Our sources they point out some pretty big challenges with this modal picture, especially when you start to think like really carefully about it.
Yeah, yeah. And the first big one, it's this existence problem. It's this idea that, well, a lot of properties, maybe even all properties, they seem to kind of presuppose that the thing having the property, well, that it exists in the first place. So take the property being a unicorn. Clearly, for something to be a unicorn, it has to actually exist.
Like it can't be a unicorn and not exist.
Exactly. Now let's think about, let's say Emma, your hypothetical prize-winning terrier. She exists happily in our world, but she could have not existed.
Oh, right, yeah.
There's a possible world out there where maybe Emma's parents, they never met, or something else happened and she never came to be. And in that world, well, Well, she can't be a dog, right? Because she doesn't exist at all. So according to that basic modal view, remember, a property is essential if an object has it in all the worlds where it exists. So being a dog, it ends up being an accidental property for Emma.
What?
Because there's a world, where she exists, well, maybe not really exists, but in that world, she doesn't have that property. She's not a dog.
Yeah.
But that clashes, like, big time with our intuition, right? That Emma is, like, fundamentally, essentially a dog.
Yeah, exactly. It just feels so wrong to say that Emma's only accidentally a
Yeah.
dog. It's like we're missing something super important about her,
Yeah.
but what she is.
Right.
So how do we fix this? The source, it talks about this existence conditioned modal characterization.
Yeah. So some philosophers, they tried to get around this problem, and they suggested this kind of refinement, a tweak to the idea. This existence conditioned view, it says that a property, let's call it P, is essential to an object, call it O, if O has P, and it's necessary that if O exists, then O has P.
Okay.
And for accidental properties, it becomes O has P. But it's possible that O lacks P and yet still exists.
Okay, so they're adding this if O exists clause to the necessity part of the definition of essentiality.
Yeah.
How does this help with Emma, our dog?
So if Emma exists, then it seems necessarily true that she's a dog. I mean, she can't exist and not be a dog, right? So with this new view, being a dog, it would actually come out as an essential property for Emma.
Okay, problem solved.
Well, not so fast. In philosophy, as you probably know, fixing one thing often leads to a whole bunch of new problems.
Oh, no.
And this fix, it leads to this pretty startling conclusion that existence becomes an essential property of, well, everything.
Hold on. How does that happen?
Think about anything at all. Your favorite armchair, the number pi, the concept of justice, whatever.
Okay.
Is it possible for that thing to, like, not exist and still exist at the same time?
No, that doesn't make any sense. That's a contradiction.
Exactly. So, according to this existence condition view, it's necessary that if your armchair exists, then it exists. I mean, that's just like stating the obvious.
Right.
And since your armchair does exist, we hope it follows that existence is an essential property of your armchair. And you can make the same argument about, well, anything that exists.
I don't know. That just feels wrong somehow. Like
Yeah.
the idea that my beat up copy of Meditations has to exist in all worlds where it exists. It just seems so empty.
Mm.
And the source points out that it has these like much bigger implications that are kind of problematic.
Yeah.
Especially for, certain religious viewpoints.
Yeah, exactly. Think about a theist, someone who believes that God's existence is unique, that God is the only being who, like, has to exist, whose very nature entails existence, while everything else exists contingently. It could have not existed. Well, this existence condition view, it rules that possibility outright from the start. And that's not good. We want a good philosophical account of, essential and accidental properties to be neutral on these kinds of big, controversial theological issues. It shouldn't take sides.
Right. It should be like flexible.
Yeah.
Right. It could be able to accommodate different views about metaphysics.
Yeah.
So the source mentions some ways philosophers have tried to deal with this problem. What kind of solutions did they come up with?
Well, one way, and this is favored by, the folks who really like that basic modal characterization, they say that, okay, when we say Emma is essentially a dog, what we really mean is that she essentially has the property of being a dog if she exists.
Okay.
So existence itself, it gets this special treatment. It's not really a property in the normal sense, So saying something has existence as an essential property, it's not really about having the property of being existent if existent. It's more like we just take it at face value. On the other hand, you have the folks who lean towards that existence condition view, and they might say that, look, when we say only God has essential existence, what we're really saying is that only God has existence as a necessary property. And they mean necessary in the strongest possible sense. A property that's possessed in all possible worlds, no matter what, even without that if existent qualification.
So it seems like both sides are kind of making a special case for existence, like they're adding an asterisk to the concept. It feels a little ad hoc, I guess.
Yeah.
But as the source points out, the whole question of what existence is, that's always been a big puzzle in philosophy. Thinkers like Kant, Russell, Frege, they famously argued that existence isn't even a real property at all.
Exactly. And if existence isn't a property, well, the whole debate changes, right?
Right.
But even if we set aside this whole issue about existence, the source moves on and it starts looking at other ways to think about essential and accidental properties, especially because of some pretty good criticisms of that whole modal approach.
Yeah, and this is where Kit Fine comes in, right? He,
Mm.
he makes this really powerful argument that the modal view, even with all the tweaks and fixes, it might still be like too broad. What's the problem, according to Fine?
So Fine, he challenges this idea that necessity is like enough for essentiality. He says essential properties, they should be, really deeply connected to a thing's fundamental nature, like what it is to be that thing.
Okay.
And he has this famous example. He points out that, well, according to the basic modal view, Socrates necessarily has this property, there being infinitely many prime numbers.
Okay.
Because, I mean, the fact that there are infinitely many primes, that's a necessary truth, right? It's true in all possible worlds. So Socrates, just by existing in any world, he exists in a world where that's true.
Right, so he has that property.
Exactly. But Fine says, intuitively, this property, it has absolutely nothing to do with what makes Socrates Socrates.
Yeah, it just seems like totally random.
Totally. And he has another example. He says, okay, the number 2, it's necessarily the only member of the set that contains only 2. So by the modal view, having the number 2 as its sole member, that's essential to that set.
Okay.
And the other way around, being the only member of that set, that's essential to the number 2. But again, Fine says this is just wrong. It's counterintuitive. These are just accidental relationships that come up because of like necessary truths, not because they're essential features of those objects themselves.
Right.
So his point is, just because something has to be true, it doesn't mean it's about like the essence of a thing. Think about it. Socrates exists in a universe with, certain laws of physics,
Right.
but those laws, they're not part of what makes him Socrates.
Yeah, it feels like a weird side effect of just focusing on necessity, right?
Yeah.
Just because something is necessarily true, it doesn't mean the property it describes. It's essential to every object.
Right. Exactly.
So what did Fine propose? He offered this other way of looking at it, this definitional characterization. What's the idea there?
So Fine says, okay, the essential properties of something, they're the ones that are part of its definition, its essence, in a more traditional way of thinking about it. Like, take the number 2, you could define it as the successor of 1, right?
Okay.
And the set containing only 2, you could define it as the set whose only member is 2. So in these cases, the essential properties, they're tied directly to these definitions.
Okay, yeah. That seems to deal with Fine's examples, right?
Yeah.
Like being such that there are infinitely many primes, that's not part of any definition of Socrates. And being the only member of that set, that's not part of what the number 2 is.
Yeah.
But the source brings up a problem for this view,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Like what even is the definition of a particular individual? Like Socrates.
Exactly. For mathematical objects, for sets, it seems like you can give them clear definitions.
Right.
But for concrete things, individuals, like people, like Socrates, it gets a lot harder to say what their definition is. It feels like we're in a totally different category here.
Yeah.
And the source makes another important point. It says, okay, even if you accept this idea that essential properties are the ones in the definition, well, it doesn't automatically mean that accidental properties are just like all the properties that aren't in the definition.
Right. It's not that simple.
Yeah.
Because, like, with that example of Socrates being the only member of the set containing him, just because it's not in his definition as a human being,
Yeah.
it doesn't necessarily mean that it feels like an accidental feature, like something you can easily change. It still seems like we need that modal idea, of possibility and necessity to really get at what accidental means.
That's a really good point. So, because of Fine's critique and all these difficulties with the basic modal view, a lot of philosophers, they've tried to refine that modal approach instead of just throwing it out completely.
Yeah.
The source goes through a bunch of these really interesting variations.
Yeah, let's get into those. So first we have Zalta's approach. He makes this distinction between abstract objects and ordinary objects. How does that help?
So in Zalta's system, all objects, it doesn't matter if they're abstracts like numbers or ordinary like Socrates, they all necessarily exist. But his big move is that ordinary objects are not necessarily concrete. Like Socrates, he could exist in some possible world in a way that's not physical, maybe like just as a concept or something. And then he has these separate accounts of essentiality for each type of object.
Okay.
So for ordinary objects, a property is essential if it's necessary that the object has it when it's concrete. And it's not necessary that the object has it, full stop, across all worlds, concrete or not.
Okay, so that second part, the not necessary, without the if concrete bit, that's the key to avoiding Fine's problem, right? The infinitely many primes problem for Socrates.
Exactly. Even when Socrates exists in these non-concrete states in other possible worlds, he still exists in a world where there are infinitely many primes.
Mm.
But it's not necessary, in Zalta's way of thinking about it, for it to be essential to Socrates. It's not necessary that he has that property across all his possible ways of existing.
Right.
Now, for abstract objects, like the set containing only Socrates, Zalta has a different criterion. He says a property is essential if it's necessarily encoded by the object.
Encoded, what does that mean?
So encoding in Zalta system, it's a technical term. It's about the properties that are like part of our concept of the object, our theory of it, not necessarily properties that the object actually has in the way that, concrete objects have properties.
Yeah.
It's kind of like the properties that a fictional character has, in a story, even if those properties don't exist in the real world.
Okay, yeah. So, like, Sherlock Holmes, he encodes being a detective, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And that's essential to him, as a fictional character in the Holmes stories.
Yeah.
But he doesn't really have that property, not like a real detective does.
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it. And the property of, there being infinitely many primes, that's not part of our idea of Sherlock Holmes, so it's not essential to him.
Right. And this also explains that weird asymmetry between Socrates and the set that contains him, right?
Exactly. It's not essential to Socrates to be an element of that set because it doesn't meet his criteria for, ordinary object essence. But it is essential to the set itself, to that abstract object, that Socrates is an element of it, because that relationship to Socrates, that's fundamental to our concept of that particular set. That's how we think about it.
Okay, interesting. So next we have Correa's idea, this locally necessary modality. What's that all about?
So Correa, he's inspired by Prior, and he has this different way of looking at modality. Instead of just thinking about like globally possible worlds, that represent like a complete state of the entire universe, he also thinks about locally possible worlds.
Locally possible world.
Yeah, which include the global ones, but also these strictly local worlds that are like incomplete. They might not have any facts about certain objects. Like
Okay.
imagine these little mini universes that don't contain everything our world does. And Correa says something is essential to an object if it's locally necessary that it has that property, given that there are any facts about that object in that local world at all.
Okay, so in a locally possible world where there are facts about Socrates, maybe just the fact that he's human, but there aren't any facts about, prime numbers, it wouldn't be locally necessary for Socrates to have that property, the property of being such that there are infinitely many primes.
Yeah, exactly.
And this gets around Fine's problem without having to rely on definitions.
Yeah, that's the idea, that condition, that local necessity condition. It acts as a filter, It gets rid of those broadly necessary truths that don't seem to be really connected to the object itself.
Okay. And then we have Brogard and Salerno with their counterfactual account. This one sounds pretty cool, like using what-if scenarios to figure out what's essential.
Yeah, it's a neat idea. They say, okay, a property is essential to an object if it's necessary that the object has it if it exists, and if nothing had that property, then the object wouldn't exist.
Okay.
And their big move here, it's in how they treat these counterfactuals that have impossible antecedents. They call them counterpossibles. They say these counterpossibles, they can actually be false, not just like vacuously true, which is, what's often assumed in standard modal logic.
Okay, so like with the infinitely many primes example, they would say even if hypothetically nothing had that property, which is impossible, right?
Yeah.
Socrates would still exist.
Yeah.
So that property is not essential to him.
Exactly. That counterfactual statement, if nothing had the property of being such that there are infinitely many primes, then Socrates wouldn't exist.
Mhm.
That would be false, according to them. And because it fails that second condition, it means that property isn't essential to Socrates.
Okay. And then we have Wildman and Cowling, and they bring in David Lewis's idea about sparse and abundant properties.
Right.
This seems to get at, like, Fine's intuition about what what feels like a natural property, a fundamental one.
Yeah, definitely. They say, okay, a property is essential to an object if it's necessarily had, if the object exists, and it's a sparse property.
Some are sparse.
Yeah, so sparse properties, those are the fundamental ones, the ones that like really carve nature at its joints, to use his famous phrase.
Okay.
And this is in contrast to abundant properties, which are, all those other logically possible properties, no matter how like weird or unnatural they seem. So the properties that Fine brought up as counterexamples, like that one about the primes, those would be abundant properties. So they wouldn't count as essential, according to Wildman and Cowling.
Right. So like being human is a sparse property for Socrates.
Right.
But being in a universe with an even number of stars, even if that's necessarily true, it's more of an abundant property.
Exactly. It feels less intrinsic, less about what Socrates is in himself.
Okay. And finally, we have Denby and his focus on intrinsic properties.
Right.
That also gets at this idea of like what something is in itself, independent of everything else.
Yeah. Denby says an essential property is one that's necessarily had if the object exists, and it's an intrinsic property, something the object has just because of its own internal makeup, not because of how it relates to other things. So that property about the primes, that's clearly extrinsic, right? It depends on like the whole structure of mathematics, not just on Socrates. So it wouldn't be essential to Socrates, according to Denby.
So we've seen all these like really smart attempts to refine that original modal view to deal with its problems.
Yeah.
It shows you how much philosophers have really struggled with this question, this seemingly simple question about what belongs to a thing in a fundamental way.
It's amazing, isn't it? And the source mentions that Fine himself, the one who started all this with his critique, he's even suggested that maybe the relationship is the other way around.
Okay.
That modal truths, they're actually grounded in truths about essence.
Oh, wow.
Like, instead of defining essence in terms of modality, he says maybe we define modality in terms of essence.
So it's the other way around.
Yeah, it's a whole other can of worms.
Definitely something for another deep dive.
For sure.
So the source moves on to talking about essentialism itself.
Right.
It gives us a general definition, and then it looks at how philosophers have tried to define who counts as an essentialist.
Yeah. The most basic definition, the one that's most widely accepted, it's just the view that at least some objects, they have at least some essential properties.
Yeah.
It's a very broad definition.
Okay.
But then the source points out that, well, some philosophers, they've given more like narrow definitions, especially when they're talking about like minimal essentialism, which is the view that only a very few properties are really essential, maybe even just trivial ones.
Okay.
And then there's maximal essentialism, which says that, all of an object's properties are essential.
Right. Maximal essentialism, that was Leibniz's view, right? That everything about a thing is essential to it.
Exactly. And then you have minimal essentialism saying maybe only like super basic properties like being F or not F, those are really essential. And some definitions of essentialism would actually exclude these extremes.
Right.
So Quine, famously, he said essentialism is the belief that some properties are essential and others are accidental. But that definition, it implicitly rules out maximal essentialism, right? And then you have Della Rocca. He has this definition that requires at least some objects to have some non-trivial necessary properties. So that could rule out minimal essentialism if those basic necessary properties are seen as trivial.
Okay.
And Yablo, he says, for something to really be essentialism, you need a strong distinction with both non-trivial essential properties and truly accidental properties. So that could potentially exclude both extremes.
Okay.
But the source says for the rest of its discussion, it's going to use that broader, more inclusive definition. That essentialism is just the view that some things have some essential properties.
That seems reasonable.
Yeah.
Good working definition.
Yeah.
Okay, so then the source goes on to look at different kinds of essentialism, different varieties, like specific claims about what sorts of properties are essential to what sorts of things.
Right. So we start with maximal essentialism, which, like we said, not a lot of people believe in nowadays, although, Leibniz's monadology, that's a famous historical example. And then we get into some more popular forms, like origin essentialism, that was defended by Kripke, Salmon, Forbes. The idea there is that an object, it couldn't have come from radically different sources. Like a person couldn't have come from different sperm and egg. A table couldn't have been made from totally different materials and so on.
Yeah, that makes sense, right? Especially when we're talking about like living things or things that were created in a specific way.
Yeah.
Okay, and then there's sortal essentialism, which says that an object, It can't be of a totally different kind than it is. Like Socrates has to be human. He can't be, I don't know, a credit card account or a prime number.
Yeah.
That also seems like a pretty basic constraint on what a thing is.
Totally. And then you have minimal essentialism, which, like the name suggests, it says that objects have very few essential properties, if any, beyond those really basic necessary ones. And Mackey, he's a big proponent of this view. And then the source talks about essentialism, about natural kinds. This one, it got really big with Kripke and Putnam and their work on how terms like cat and water refer. The idea here is that there are these necessary a posteriori connections,
Okay.
truths that are necessary, but we can only discover them through experience, through empirical investigation, like the fact that cats are necessarily animals or that water is necessarily H2O.
But it's important to remember, and the source makes this point, that essentialism about natural kinds, it doesn't automatically mean that individuals of those kinds also have sortal essences. Like, just because it's necessary that all cats are animals, it doesn't mean that this cat, Whiskers, is essentially an animal in every possible world where Whiskers exist. Maybe, just maybe, Whiskers could have been, like, a robot in disguise from birth, even if all real cats have to be animals?
Yeah, it's a subtle distinction, but an important one.
Mm-hmm.
And the source makes a similar point about necessary a priori connections, like the fact that all mathematicians are rational or that all bachelors are unmarried.
Right.
Those don't automatically tell us about the essential properties of, individual mathematicians or bachelors.
Right. Like, because I'm a mathematician, that means I'm rational. That's part of the definition.
Right.
But it doesn't mean that being a mathematician is essential to me, like in all possible worlds. Maybe in another world, I don't know, a professional juggler,
Right.
and I've never even seen a math equation.
Exactly.
Okay. And then we get to this idea of an individual essence, a property that's not only essential to a thing, but it's also unique to it. Like, having that property is enough to pick out that exact object
Yeah.
and no other. The source mentions this idea of Hakesides,
Yeah, haste.
like thisness.
Right. Those are those super specific individual properties, the property of being this very individual. It's as specific as you can get. But some philosophers, like Leibniz in his own way, and later Forbes, they argued for more substantial qualitative individual essences. Leibniz, he thought that every individual substance, it has this complete concept that uniquely defines it across all possible worlds, although this concept is in terms of, general qualities. And Forbes, he argued for individual essences that are based on an object's its unique origin,